June 18, 1815. A muddy field in Belgium. The most powerful military mind in Europe is about to make a decision that will change the course of human history forever. In just 12 hours, an empire will fall, a legend will be broken, and one man's destiny will be sealed in blood and rain. But here's what almost nobody talks about. Napoleon didn't just lose the Battle of Waterloo. He lost it in the most bizarre, unexpected, and frankly shocking ways possible. And when you hear the real reasons why, you won't believe how close he actually came to winning. How one rainstorm, one stubborn general, and one tragic mistake turned victory into catastrophic defeat. This is the story they don't teach you in school. This is the truth about Waterloo. Let's rewind for a second. Who even was Napoleon Bonaparte by 1815? This wasn't just some French general. This was a man who had conquered most of Europe. A guy who went from literally nothing, a poor kid from Corsica, to becoming Emperor of France. He'd defeated Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Spain. He'd rewritten the laws of an entire continent. He was considered by many to be the greatest military genius who ever lived. But then he made a mistake. He invaded Russia in 1812, and it destroyed him. His grand army of over 600,000 men was reduced to less than 100,000 survivors. Europe smelled blood in the water. They ganged up on him. By 1814, Napoleon was forced to give up his throne and was exiled to a tiny island called Elba. Most people would have stayed there, enjoyed retirement, written their memoirs. Not Napoleon. In March 1815, he escaped. He landed back in France with just 1,000 men. And here's where it gets wild. The French king sent an army to arrest him. But when those soldiers saw Napoleon, they didn't shoot him. They joined him. One by one, entire regiments switched sides. Within 20 days, without firing a single shot, Napoleon was back in Paris, back in power, back as emperor. Europe freaked out. Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia immediately declared war. They called him an outlaw, a threat to peace. They assembled massive armies to crush him once and for all. Napoleon knew he had one chance, one narrow window. He had to strike fast before all those armies could unite against him. So he marched north into Belgium with about 120,000 men. His plan was simple but brilliant. Destroy the British and Prussian armies separately before they could join forces. And honestly, it almost worked. The days before Waterloo, on June 16th, Napoleon split his forces. He sent Marshal Ney to hold off the British while he personally attacked the Prussians at a place called Ligny, and he crushed them, absolutely demolished the Prussian army. Their commander, an old warrior named Blücher, had his horse shot out from under him and was trampled by cavalry. Everyone thought he was dead. Napoleon was ecstatic. One enemy down, one to go. He ordered Marshal Grouchy to chase the retreating Prussians and make sure they kept running. Meanwhile, he'd turn his attention to the British commander, the Duke of Wellington, and finish him off. This is where things started to go wrong. But Napoleon didn't know it yet. The first mistake? Grouchy. Marshal Grouchy was a solid commander. Dependable. But he wasn't brilliant. And Napoleon needed brilliant. Here's what happened. The Prussians didn't retreat east toward their homeland like Napoleon expected. They retreated north toward the British, toward Wellington. Blücher, who survived being trampled because he was apparently made of iron, ordered his battered army to march through the night to help Wellington. Grouchy had 33,000 men. His job was to follow the Prussians and keep them away from the main battle, but he lost track of them. On the morning of Waterloo, Grouchy was miles away in the wrong direction, chasing ghosts. Some of his officers heard the cannons from Waterloo. They begged him to march toward the sound of the guns, to help Napoleon. But Grouchy had his orders: follow the Prussians. So that's what he did. All day long, while Napoleon fought for his life, 33,000 French soldiers sat on the sidelines doing basically nothing. 1/3 of Napoleon's army gone because of a miscommunication. The second mistake: The rain. The night before Waterloo, it rained. And I'm not talking about a light drizzle. This was a biblical downpour, the kind of rain that turns fields into swamps. Napoleon's men slept in the mud. Their gunpowder got wet. Their boots got soaked. Morale started to sink. But the real problem was tactical. Napoleon's favorite weapon was artillery. He loved using massive cannon bombardments to soften up enemy positions before sending in his infantry. But cannons don't work well in mud. The cannonballs would hit the soft ground and just sink instead of bouncing and cutting through enemy lines. So when Napoleon woke up on June 18th and saw the muddy mess, he made a decision. He'd wait for the ground to dry out a bit before attacking. Just a few hours. What could go wrong? Everything. Everything could go wrong. Every hour Napoleon waited was another hour for the Prussians to get closer. Wellington knew this. He was positioned on a ridge near a small town called Waterloo, and he was desperately buying time. If he could hold out long enough, Blücher would arrive with reinforcements. If Napoleon attacked early, Wellington might crack before help arrived. The rain had just handed Wellington a gift, and Napoleon didn't realize it. The battle begins. Around 11:30 a.m., Napoleon finally gave the order to attack. His strategy was straightforward. He'd pound Wellington's center with artillery, then send in wave after wave of infantry to break through. Once the British line cracked, his cavalry would pour through and slaughter the retreating enemy. It should have worked. Napoleon had done this 100 times before, but Wellington wasn't a normal opponent. He'd fought in India and Spain. He'd studied Napoleon's tactics, and he had a trick up his sleeve. Most of Wellington's infantry was positioned on the reverse slope of the ridge. Napoleon's artillery was firing at empty ground. The cannonballs sailed overhead, while British soldiers waited safely on the other side of the hill. When French infantry came marching up in their massive columns, drums beating, flags flying, Wellington's men would suddenly appear at the crest of the ridge in long, thin lines. 2 ranks deep, every musket pointed at the French. And they'd fire. Devastating volleys at point-blank range. The French columns would stagger, break, and retreat. Again and again. The cavalry charges. Around 4 p.m., Marshal Ney saw what he thought was Wellington's army retreating. Wounded soldiers and supply wagons were pulling back from the ridge. Ney got excited. He thought they were breaking, so he ordered the cavalry to charge. Thousands of French horsemen, the finest in Europe, thundered up the hill in one of the most spectacular and foolish attacks in military history. Here's the thing about cavalry. They're devastating against infantry in the open. But Wellington's infantry weren't in the open. They formed squares. Imagine a box of soldiers, all facing outward with bayonets pointed out. Horses won't charge into a wall of sharp metal. They just won't. The French cavalry swirled around these squares like a storm, but they couldn't break them. British infantry fired volley after volley into the horsemen. Hundreds of men and horses fell. Ney had 5 horses shot from under him. 5. And he kept ordering more charges. Napoleon watched this disaster unfold and reportedly said, "This is an hour too soon." But he couldn't stop it now. He had to commit more reserves to support Ney's reckless attack. Thousands of France's best cavalrymen were being slaughtered for nothing. La Haye-Sainte. While the cavalry was dying on the ridge, a smaller but crucial fight was happening at a farm called La Haye-Sainte. A few hundred German troops fighting for Britain held this fortified farmhouse right in the center of the battlefield. French infantry attacked it again and again. The fighting was brutal, hand-to-hand combat in barns and gardens. The Germans ran out of ammunition and started throwing rocks. Finally, around 6 p.m., the French broke through and captured it. This was actually a huge moment. From La Haye-Sainte, French artillery could now fire directly at Wellington's center at close range. The British line started to crack. Wellington later said this was the crisis point of the entire battle. Napoleon saw the opening. If he had fresh reserves, he could punch through right now and win. But where were his reserves? They were committed elsewhere. And Marshal Grouchy, with 33,000 men, was still wandering around miles away. And then Napoleon saw something on the horizon that made his blood run cold. The Prussians arrive. Blücher had kept his promise. His battered, exhausted army had marched through mud and misery to reach the battlefield. Around 4 p.m., Prussian troops started appearing on Napoleon's right flank. At first, it was just a few units. Napoleon had to pull troops from his attack on Wellington to deal with this new threat. He sent his young guard to hold the Prussians at a village called Plancenoit. The fighting there was vicious. The village changed hands multiple times. Buildings burned. But more and more Prussians kept arriving. By 7 p.m., there were over 30,000 of them attacking Napoleon's flank. Napoleon's army was now caught between two forces, Wellington in front, Prussians on the side. The window of victory was slamming shut. The final gamble. Napoleon had one card left to play: his Imperial Guard. These were the elite of the elite, veterans who had followed him from Egypt to Moscow. They had never, ever been defeated in a frontal assault. Around 7 p.m., Napoleon personally led them forward, partway up the slope, then handed command to Ney for the final attack. About 3,000 of France's finest soldiers marched up that ridge in perfect formation, drums beating, into the smoke and chaos. Wellington saw them coming. He'd been waiting for this. He had his own elite troops lying down behind the ridge crest, British Guards, veteran infantry. When the French Imperial Guard was just 40 paces away, Wellington gave the order: "Stand up, Guards!" Suddenly, 2,500 British soldiers appeared as if from nowhere. They fired a massive volley directly into the Imperial Guard. The French staggered, but kept coming. Another volley, men falling. Still they advanced. Then Wellington ordered a bayonet charge from the flank. The British swept into the Imperial Guard's side. For the first time in their history, the Imperial Guard broke. They retreated. Someone in the French army shouted, "La Garde recule!" The Guard retreats. Panic spread like wildfire. If the Guard could be beaten, anyone could be beaten. French units all across the battlefield started to collapse. The collapse. Wellington saw his moment. He took off his hat and waved it toward the French, the signal for a general advance. The entire British line surged forward with a cheer. At the same moment, the Prussians broke through at Plancenoit. Napoleon's army was hit from two sides at once. What had been an organized army turned into a mob. Soldiers threw down their weapons and ran. Artillery was abandoned. The great French war machine simply fell apart. Napoleon tried to rally his old guard to cover the retreat. They formed squares and died where they stood, buying time for others to escape. By nightfall, Napoleon's army had ceased to exist. Over 25,000 French soldiers were dead or wounded. Thousands more were captured. The greatest military mind in Europe had suffered the most complete defeat of his career. The aftermath. Napoleon fled the battlefield in his carriage. He reached Paris and tried to rally support for continued resistance. But nobody wanted to fight anymore. France was exhausted. His own government turned against him. On June 22nd, just 4 days after Waterloo, Napoleon abdicated for the second and final time. He tried to escape to America, but the British caught him. This time, they weren't taking chances. They shipped him to St. Helena, a remote island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. He spent his last 6 years there, writing his memoirs, fighting with his British jailers, and slowly dying of stomach cancer. He died on May 5, 1821. He was 51 years old. Why did he really lose? So what actually defeated Napoleon at Waterloo? Let's break it down. First, the rain. It delayed his attack and gave the Prussians time to arrive. Without that delay, he might have crushed Wellington before Blücher showed up. Second, Grouchy's failure. 1/3 of Napoleon's army spent the day marching in the wrong direction. If those 33,000 men had been at Waterloo, the battle would have been completely different. Third, Ney's reckless cavalry charges. Thousands of elite horsemen were wasted in pointless attacks against infantry squares. Those men were needed for the final push. Fourth, Wellington's skill. He chose perfect defensive ground and used it brilliantly. He kept his cool under incredible pressure. Fifth, Blücher's determination. That 72-year-old Prussian general got trampled by horses, survived, and marched his exhausted army through the night to reach the battle. His arrival sealed Napoleon's fate. But there's a deeper answer. Napoleon himself was different. He wasn't the sharp, energetic genius of his earlier campaigns. Some historians think he was sick at Waterloo, possibly suffering from hemorrhoids or stomach problems. He seemed slower, less decisive. He delegated too much to subordinates like Ney, who made terrible decisions. The Napoleon of 1805 would have crushed Wellington. The Napoleon of 1815 couldn't get it done. The legacy Waterloo ended 23 years of almost continuous European warfare. It established Britain as the dominant world power for the next century. It redrew the map of Europe. It ended the age of revolution and ushered in an era of conservative monarchy. But it also created a legend. Napoleon became more famous in defeat than he ever was in victory. His story became the ultimate tale of rise and fall, of genius and hubris, of glory and tragedy. And that muddy field in Belgium? It became the most famous battlefield in history, the place where the impossible happened, where the unbeatable general was beaten, where an empire fell in a single day. So the next time someone tells you Napoleon lost Waterloo because he was a bad general, you'll know the truth. He lost because of rain and mud, because of a subordinate who got lost, because of another subordinate who was too aggressive, because of an old Prussian who refused to quit, and because Wellington was just good enough to survive until help arrived. Napoleon came within hours of winning, a few different decisions, a bit of better luck, and we'd be telling a completely different story. That's what makes Waterloo so fascinating. It wasn't inevitable. It was close, terrifyingly close. History turned on the edge of a knife that day, and we're still feeling the effects 200 years later. If this story blew your mind, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button because we've got dozens more historical mysteries like this one. Stories they don't teach you. Truths that'll change how you see the world. And if you made it this far, drop a comment and tell me. Do you think Napoleon could have won if just one thing had gone differently? I read every single comment. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.